in the migrant sample is happening. So basically, cluster 3 migrants, daughters from households with prior US migrants, they prevailed exactly in the late 1980s to early 1990s after the passage of IRCA when visas were available. So I call this group the network migrants. Now the fourth group is the really puzzling one. So the fourth group had some presence, and then it consistently increased over the years through the 1990s and 2000, and now it's the majority group. If we look at the data from 2005 to 2010, almost 70% of all migrants in the MMP data belong to this last group. And if you remember what this group was, these are educated, more educated people from the cities, from the urban areas. Now, there's actually no theory that would predict this group to prevail. And only recently, some scholars started to write about this phenomenon of urban migration. And there are a number of ideas on why this is happening. So one idea is increasing economic integration with the United States, economic restructuring in the cities, which basically shifted the industrial composition, and suddenly some people found their skills devalued, their safety nets evaporated, and there's also the moving of poverty from rural to urban regions in this period. So the infrastructure of a lot of cities like Mexico City is no longer sufficient to support the population, and that's when again we see migration from cities taking off. But again, this is actually a relatively new phenomenon, and there is not a lot of literature on this. What I'm showing here is the trade, the logarithm of trade between Mexico and the United States. And again, there seems to be some correlation, but I don't think this is basically conclusive evidence. It's consistent with the arguments about economic restructuring, but I think we need to do a bit more analysis and collect maybe more data to see why this is happening exactly. So I call this group in the data urban migrants. And there's no theoretical model, micro-level model that fits this profile, but then the general phenomenon seems to be in line with globalization arguments, increasing penetration from the US, creating disruptions in Mexico, and leading to more migration. So basically, to summarize, what we have here is a typology of migrants that has a very specific time signature. And the time signature for each migrant group seems to correspond to major changes in the Mexico-US migration context. Now there's another pattern that I observed, but I don't know what to make of it exactly. So what we see here is the first three groups. And as I was explaining to them, I associated the first group with the neoclassical economic idea, and the second one with the risk diversification or the new economics paradigm, and the third one with network migration or cumulative causation as it's known in sociology. Now, the vertical lines here show the timing of the most cited 3 articles on each theory. So we see that the neoclassical economic articles on migration were written in the 1970s. The new economics of labor migration, basically the founding papers were written in the mid-1980s, and Doug Massey's cumulative causation papers came in the 1990s. So basically there seems to be an overlap between what's happening in the Mexico-US flow and what kind of theories gain prominence. So what to make of this? So I don't think we can say that these people, the theories, were trying to capture what's happening in the US or from Mexico to the US at the time. And as I tried to explain in the beginning, actually in each discipline there were specific dynamics that led to the development of these theories. In the 1970s, a lot of economics was about human capital. You know, American Economic Association president talked about human capital. Nobel Prize in that period went to human capital. So the neoclassical model of migration is a basic application of that. It has nothing to do with the empirical facts. The same thing with the risk diversification paradigm. It was huge in finance, another Nobel Prize went to it, and again, straightforward application of that idea to migration. And if we look at network migration, the idea always existed. If you read anthropologists from the 1950s, they talk about chain migration. But then it was Massey's article that kind of systematized it under a different framework of cumulative causation. So it's not necessarily that these theories were trying to capture the empirical period, but perhaps because they did, they got to be so big, they got so many citations. So we're working on a more detailed analysis of these citations, basically who's citing whom and for what reason, and trying to see if there's any kind of overlap with these empirical patterns. But I think it's just an interesting thing, and I didn't want to let it go just yet. So basically, what we did here is look at migrants, look at the diversity among migrants, identify groups, and try to see under what conditions each group proliferates. But is this typology really useful for anything else? Are we just explaining the data? Or can we use this to actually predict how these migrants do once they come to the United States? So I used the migrant types actually to see if I can predict any post-migration outcomes. So some of the patterns that came out were the following. The first two groups, the income maximizers and risk diversifiers, actually did the highest number of trips to the United States. So they were coming back and forth, and they were the most likely to be undocumented. So also remember, so these people had short-term economic goals. You know, they were trying to make enough money, or they were trying to escape a crisis in Mexico. But they were also migrating at a period when the border protection was not as, as strong as it is in later periods. So they proliferated in the 1970s and 80s. So these findings are actually consistent with that. If we look at network migrants making use of the family reunification policies, they're also most likely to be unemployed because they're mostly women and children. And if you look at urban migrants, they command the highest wages. And remember, these are more educated people from the cities. So again, these migrant types help us understand their settlement patterns here, whether they go back to Mexico, so they can be predictive in a way, not only descriptive. So I said we also did some qualitative work in Mexico, and in the book, these stories and the data kind of are trying to come together in a peaceful way. So here, I'll give you some examples. So why I started doing field work was, once I absorbed these migrant groups, it was all great, so I thought, this is great, there are different groups of people, and they're possibly migrating for different reasons. But I also wanted to see if people talk differently about migration, if people would give me different reasons for their migration. So we went to Mexico, and we had a team of 8 people. We stayed there for 2 months, and then a follow-up team went for another 2 months. And we interviewed about 140 people. Some of them were return migrants, some of them were left behind wives or parents or children. So basically, I'm going to select some stories and share them with you. So the first story is from a migrant I will call Jorge. So Jorge came here as a 14-year-old in 1987. He basically escaped his family and came here on his own. And he did really well. He stayed here for 22 years, and then all of a sudden he got deported, went back to Mexico. So this is when we found him, and he was planning his last trip to the United States when we talked to him. So we asked him, why did you stay a migrant? Why did you migrate in the first place? And he said this, that appeared in many other statements. So he said, if you do your math, as I have, 200 pesos a day that I earn here against $190 or $200 that I made there every day, you see the difference. I earn 2,000 pesos. What I earn in 1 week here, I earn there in 1 day's job. So he's talking about the differential wages in 2 countries that affected his decision. But he also talked about how it's important to save. And there's only one way you can save in the United States. So he explained it as, the way you live is the following. Men, when they leave from here, they go single. Or they're married, but they go alone. And they all gather from anywhere, and they all rent an apartment. In a 2-story apartment, there live about 6, 7 guys. They all divide the expenses, so you end up paying about $30 or $40 per month. And for your food, you don't spend more than $120. So everything you've earned in that month, if you save it, you send it for your family. It's a strong investment. But if you have your family over there with you, he means you have to rent your own place, but just for your family and for you and for your children. So basically, he said the reason you see these single migrants or men coming here is also because it's cost effective to do that way. If you bring your family here, you have all these expenses. If you come alone, then you can actually save more. So again, we assumed some groups to be following this income maximization strategy, but what these interviews tell us is, yes, that's the case. Individuals are trying to increase their earnings, but it's not just for themselves, also for the sake of the family. And it's one individual acting alone most times because it's more cost effective that way. Now in the Mexican context, that individual is often a man, the household head. Because migration is seen riskier as women, and because the cultural ideal is for the man, the household of the head of the household, to provide for the family. And Jorge actually talked about this as well when we asked him about women, why women migrate. So he said the problem is in the crossing. If you don't have a relative who goes and picks you up, no, they're really assholes, the coyotes. He's talking about the smugglers. They're abusers, and they're very, I tell you because I've talked with a lot of Latina women. Many are raped and left behind and all. A lot of cruelty. And the worst part is that all Mexican coyotes are the ones doing that silliness. That's the problem. So that's what's preventing a lot of women from migrating. So when we asked Jorge what his goal was, to stay in the US or come back, he basically said he's planning one last trip to come to the US and to pick up his tools and to save some more money and then go back to Mexico and establish a business. So he said his dream was to have his own workshop. That's the thing of an immigrant, to go, work over there, and come and do something here. So basically, even when we're talking about income maximization, we're not talking about this infinite time horizon where you're trying to earn as much as you can, but you have a target in your mind. And for most migrants, it's buying a piece of land or buying a house. So this is one example where Jorge decided on his own to migrate, came here, made some money, made a family, and now he's planning to go back to Mexico. For some migrants, the decision process was actually quite different. So migration was more of a family affair, and it was decided not just within the nuclear family, but also within the extended family. And it kind of was talked of as an elaborate arrangement where different members each had a role to play. Now, one example is a father of a migrant that we talked to. His name is, I will call him Eugenio, and he has a son. So his son Alvaro was just married. He had a young infant son, and he was approached by a recruiter. And this recruiter from the US offered to give him a visa. But Alvaro was actually very reluctant because he didn't have enough money for his visa, first of all, and also he didn't want to leave his wife behind. So this is when the whole family actually stepped in. So the father describes it as, we talked about our situation here in community and told him, if you want to go, you decide. You're still young, and so you have to think about it. We support you if you want to go. And yes, everyone agreed. Nobody said no. If you want to visit, go ahead. If they offer you the documents, you go and see if you can work. If it's too hard, you just come back. So here the family is offering to take care of everything, and in fact in the end it was the father who offered to pay for the visa expenses, and he took in Alvaro's wife and son. And so Eugenio, when we prodded him more about what was happening in the community, talked about this magical villages initiative. So some villages in Mexico have been designated touristic attraction places, and they're called the magical villages. So they live in one of those villages where over time there was so much interest from the city that a lot of people buying homes and the property prices rising really high, becoming unaffordable for the local population. So he said, people come to buy at very high prices. Here a small lot is around 60,000-70,000 pesos, and with the employment we have here now, most people here make 1,000 pesos per week, and that's it. It's not magical, it's tragical. So the conditions he describes is that very high prices suddenly increasing. It's not very different from the 1980s that we saw, where there was very high inflation and suddenly everything changed for middle-income families. Now, while his son is away, what Eugenio is doing is taking care of the wife and the kid. And in return for that, he's expecting Alvaro to send some money so that he could add another room to his own house. So this is where the idea of an implicit contract comes in. So he says, and now she's with us, this girl, the wife, and it's a little crowded, but we're all here. One day, maybe we will, as I told you, build a room, right? But now we haven't used the money for the house. He's talking about the remittance money. He hasn't sent much.